Hi everyone. Today for Found, we're actually going to finish the book because there's only about 18 pages left. So we're starting on page 294 on chapter 32. Nobody got hungry. Nobody had to go to the bathroom. Those were the good things. But also, nobody could leave the cave. Nobody could go back to their regular lives, see their parents again, talk to their usual friends, grow up. Before, Jonah had no sense of time stopping. He'd been too busy crashing to the floor, grabbing for the elucidator, running for the ropes. But now, time, or really the lack of it, hung heavily on him. He didn't even care anymore about finding out which missing child from history he was. The other kids were no more motivated. Everyone sat around, completely enervated. You know that saying about how time flies when you're having fun? Emily, the girl who'd been so soothing before, asked as she plucked pointlessly at her sweatshirt sleeve. Yeah, Jonah said. I thought the opposite of that was the last 5 minutes of math class, when the teacher's going on and on and on about decimals, she said. She yawned. I didn't know it could be this bad. Yeah, Jonah said again. He thought about adding, I know what you mean, but it didn't seem to be worth the effort. Think, he commanded himself in disgust. Make a decision, future or past or future. He couldn't decide. It was like taking one of those multiple choice tests in school when he wasn't sure of the answer, so he tried eliminating all the choices he was sure were wrong, and then discovered that there were no possible right answers left. Going to the future would mean giving up everything. For that matter, so would going to the past. And probably dying, on top of everything else. He couldn't get the images out of his head of those brutal deaths from history, the chopped off heads, the sword slicing flesh, the hail of gunfire raining down on children. I'm a coward, he whispered to himself. I don't want to die, especially not like that. But he'd been raised by such nerdy, square parents who dragged him off to Sunday school and Boy Scout meetings and had talked so seriously about how important it was to be a good person. Because of that, he kind of felt like JB had the best argument. JB wanted to save the world. Mr. Hodge and Gary didn't seem to care. I don't want to die, he muttered, a little more loudly this time. Maybe if everyone agreed to go back to the past, he'd be one of the lucky ones. Maybe he'd be someone who just kind of accidentally vanished from history, who still had a good life waiting for him in the past. Maybe he was one of those British princes. He could get used to chomping down on huge turkey leg like some old-time king in a movie, couldn't he? And living in a castle and having thousands of soldiers at his command and... He looked around. He didn't want any of the other kids to die either. Angela caught his eye. Cautiously, as if she was trying not to be seen by anyone else, she raised one eyebrow and mouthed something. Walk? What did that mean? Oh, no. Maybe it was talk? What good was that? How could they talk when she was sitting right next to JB? Jonah remembered Catherine was still holding the elucidator. Chip still had the taser in his hand. They still had some control. Jonah stood up. We're facing a very important choice, he said. Wonderful, he thought. I sound like someone running for 7th grade student council. But everyone was staring at him now. He had to go on. And yet, we don't know if we can trust the information we've been given. He turned to face the adults. How do we know you're all not working together? JB and Mr. Hodge looked at him like he'd gone crazy. It was kind of a no-brainer. Jonah was absolutely certain that those two weren't on the same side. Still, Jonah forged ahead. So we're going to take each of you to a different corner of the room and talk to you individually, he said. What good will that do? One of the other kids jeered. It figured. It was one of the kids in black sweatshirts with skulls on the back. Jonah shrugged. I think it's worth a try, he said. It's better than sitting around doing nothing. Somehow, that energized the other kids. Within 5 minutes, or what would have been 5 minutes if time had been moving, one group of kids was clustered around Gary in the front right part of the cave, and another around Mr. Hodge in the front left. Chip was with JB and a few others in the back right corner, and Jonah, Catherine, Alex, and Emily were in the group with Angela in the back left. Quick, what do you think we should do? Jonah hissed. One look at Angela's anguished face killed his hopes. I don't know much more about this time travel stuff than you do, she said. I can tell you this. The man you keep calling JB is sincere. That Hodge character doesn't seem very trustworthy. Great. Jonah had managed to figure that out all by himself. What's JB's real name? Catherine asked. Names in the future are very weird, Angela said. I can hardly pronounce it. It's something like Alonzo Alfred Aloysius Kata. You might as well keep calling him JB. How far in the future are we talking about? Emily asked. He won't tell me, Angela said. He says I've already been contaminated enough. She grinned. He says I was supposed to marry a plumber and have 5 kids. I told him, I don't think so. He must have mixed me up with someone else. Jonah closed his eyes for a moment. Maybe JB and Hodge and Gary had Jonah mixed up with somebody else, too. Wouldn't it be nice to just have ordinary birth parents? Confused high school kids, maybe, who realized that they weren't mature enough to raise themselves. Where did you go that day at the library? Catherine asked Angela. Jonah saw you disappear. You mean earlier this afternoon? Angela asked. No, it was like 3 weeks ago, Catherine said. Angela stared at her in disbelief. Get out, she said. Really? She shook her head. This time stuff can really mess with your mind. Honestly, to me, it was just like an hour ago, maybe an hour and a half. Jonah squinted at her. 3 weeks felt like an hour to you? He said. Because I wasn't in time, as JB calls it, Angela said. He took me to this place called Outer Time, where we could spy on all of history. It's hard to describe, but it was kind of like being in an airplane and looking down on everything happening on the ground. Or, I don't know, like Google Earth, where you can focus in close on one spot, then zoom out and get a broader view too. So JB and Hodge and Gary can zip back and forth through time? Jonah said, with a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. They could go back and, I don't know, tackle me as I was walking to the cave a little bit ago, sending me back or forward in time that way? The feeling of hopelessness was coming back. He pictured himself being sent back and forth endlessly, JB and Hodge fighting over him for centuries. No, Angela said, it doesn't work that way. There's something else JB called the paradox of the doubles. No one can live through a particular time more than once. So, for example, there couldn't have been 2 or 3 copies of JB, jumped in from 2 or 3 different times, waiting at the back of the cave to attack Gary, or 2 or 3 copies of me, either. That made Jonah feel a little better. And, Angela continued, I don't pretend to understand all of this, but because of your plane crashing into our time, where it doesn't belong, where it changed lots of people's lives, because of that, we've all been living through what's known as damaged time. Kind of like a nuclear wasteland, maybe? When Mr. Hodge said that he couldn't get you all for 13 years, he really meant it. Time travelers couldn't get in at all for a long time, and they could see only limited moments, like some birthday party where you drank lots of Mountain Dew, Jonah? Jonah flushed with embarrassment. I was only 10, he wanted to protest, but Angela was still explaining. And then when they could get in, she said, it was only at spots that they called points of damage, places where the pain of the time damage was most intense. Catherine, Jonah, you know how you saw JB at Mr. Reardon's office, how he appeared and disappeared? Yeah, Jonah said. Catherine just nodded. That's because those were the only spots he could go to. Mr. Reardon was standing in the bathroom when he found out about the plane landing, and his boss was standing by that desk when he heard about the plane disappearing. So those were openings for JB, Angela said. But the other janitor came out into the waiting room, Jonah said. The guy who gave me the Mountain Dew? He truly was a janitor for the FBI, Angela said. JB bribed him to help. At least that meant the other janitor wasn't still hiding at the back of the cave, waiting to jump into action. Probably not anyway. So when JB gave us the file of names, what did he want us to do with it? Jonah asked. He was just trying to temporarily increase the damage so he could get closer to you, Angela said. He didn't expect you to be enterprising enough to take pictures of the files and call the phone numbers and meet with me. Catherine was grinning. I'm the one who thought of taking pictures, she whispered to Emily, even though Emily couldn't possibly have known what she was talking about. But all your enterprise just gave Gary an opening to try and grab you at the library, Angela said. We had too many people in the same room at the same time with connections to the mysterious plane, and then you had those printouts of the witnesses and survivors list. I don't really understand how it works, but that created a huge doorway. Catherine's grin faded a little. Jonah was trying to put it all together. So who sent the letters? He asked. JB or Hodge? They each sent one, Angela said. Again, so they could get close to you. but they were racing each other, so they wrote the letters back in the 1990s on ancient computers programmed for automatic printout. They routed their messages through the mailrooms of giant corporations, so your letters went through time machines set up automatically, stuff envelopes with bills or credit card offers. But the letters came in plain white envelopes, Jonah said. They programmed that, Angela said. That worked the way they wanted it to, but the old computers cut off parts of their messages, so they had to use other methods as well. That was probably why they resorted to putting post-it notes on the adoption papers, Jonah thought. And then when Jonah saw the mysterious figure searching his room, when Chip's computer files vanished, was that just to increase the damage? Each unexplained event made Jonah and Chip and Catherine more paranoid and worried and scared. Had the other kids faced similar mysteries? Did it even matter who had done those things, JB or Hodge? Angela was still talking. It took JB a long time to figure out that Hodge had chosen this adoption conference to steal you all back, she said. JB thinks Hodge must have set up this cave 20 years ago, before the start of damage time. He just had to trust that everything would stay ready. Then Hodge and Gary broke hundreds of rules arranging for kids to move here so they could pick up everyone at once. JB had to scramble to find all the addresses by looking at property records from the future. Jonah felt dizzy, trying to figure out all the connections through time. Future, past, the words didn't have the same meanings he'd always counted on. In this strange new framework, the future could be the past, and the past could be the future, and... Oh, I see, Catherine said, as if she understood everything. That's why it looked like the FBI knew Daniela McCarthy's new address before her parents had even made an offer on the house. Angela nodded. Property transactions aren't always recorded accurately, she said. Normally, time travelers don't do things like that, relying on future addresses to send letters into the past. But this was a desperate case, because of Hodge and Gary. JB says they totally mucked up time. Jonah could kind of picture it. He remembered a Boy Scout hike once where his troop had come upon a clear, shallow stream. Jonah and a bunch of other boys had jumped in and raced around splashing each other, even scooping up mud balls to throw at each other. The scoutmaster had given them a long lecture about disrupting nature. By the end of it, Jonah felt guilty about how many protozoans he'd probably killed. He could see how time could be like that clear stream. Probably Chip's family wasn't supposed to move. Probably some other family was supposed to be in that house down the street from Jonah's house. And there had been at least 12 families who'd moved. At least 12 families whose lives were changed. No, 36 families, Jonah thought, with a sudden lump in his throat. Mom and Dad weren't supposed to adopt me. Were they supposed to adopt some other kid? Was Catherine supposed to have a brother at all? Catherine seemed to be thinking along similar lines. So if JB managed to fix all that time in the past, even if he sent the kids back, how would he fix all the damage now? She said in a thick voice. How would he tell my parents that they don't have a son anymore? I don't know, Angela admitted. He's really worried about my non-existent 5 kids, too. The way he acts... You'd think one of them was going to be a president someday. Jonah squinted off toward the other side of the room, thinking. Just then, he heard screams and saw kids jumping up in groups gathered around Gary. No, not just kids. Gary himself. Hey! Jonah screamed. Who untied Gary? For that, improbably, was what seemed to have happened. With the ropes dragging uselessly behind him, Gary was racing across the room. Some kids are smart enough to know the future's the only choice, Gary shouted. But somehow Jonah had expected them all to vote on their decision. Didn't everyone believe in democracy? Suddenly he realized where Gary was headed. Chip! Jonah yelled. Watch out! Gary was already slamming against Chip, jerking the taser out of his hands before Chip had time to react. Gary whirled around, running again. He pointed the taser at Jonah. No, he was pointing at Catherine. Ah! Catherine screamed, crashing onto the floor. The elucidator dropped from her hand. Jonah bent down to pick it up, but Gary was already there, pulling it away, and punching in instructions, it seemed. He tucked the taser under his arm and pounded in a whole string of coding on the elucidator. Then he looked up, smirking, in JB's direction. Too bad, loser, Gary said mockingly. I guess some of us are just better at being persuasive. No, you can't, JB gasped. Do the age reversal first, Mr. Hodge suggested from across the room, completely ignoring JB. This group will be easier to deal with as babies. Yes, sir, Gary said, grinning broadly as he punched in more buttons. He took a step back and pointed the elucidator toward Jonah and Catherine and all the other kids gathered around Angela. You feel well enough to stand up yet, sweetie? He said to Catherine, who was still sprawled on the floor, recovering from the taser blast. Emily was bent over her, quietly pulling the barbs out. That would make things a little easier for me. Catherine lifted her head. I'm not Daniela McCarthy, she screamed. She had tears in her eyes. Being tasered must truly hurt. I lied. I'm not one of your missing kids from history. I'm just his sister, she pointed at Jonah. You have to let me go. You have to let everyone go. No, that can't be. Mr. Hodge glared at Gary and hopped toward him, pulling against the ropes. I thought you said all the handprints all matched. They did, Gary insisted. I didn't touch the rock, Catherine said. I just pretended, so you can't zap me. Gary looked at Mr. Hodge, who'd stopped hopping. They both shrugged. Oh well, Gary said. 35 treasures, 1 mistake. He smirked at Catherine. I'm sure we'll find someone who'd be willing to take you. You can't do this, JB screamed. That's another violation of time. Gary raised the elucidator, pointing it carefully again. What will you tell our parents? Catherine demanded. Freak rock cave-in. Such a tragedy, Gary said carelessly. 36 children killed, and sadly, the bodies will never be found. Jonah thought about his parents losing both him and Catherine, all because Catherine had been so stubbornly loyal. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But what could he do? Gary had the taser and the elucidator. He had muscles in his arms thicker than Jonah's legs. Jonah leaped at Gary anyways. Chapter 33. Even in mid-air, Jonah had no idea what he intended to do to Gary. Arm wrestling him for the elucidator or the taser was out of the question. Punching him would be as useless as punching a brick wall. So Jonah decided to take a page out of Catherine's book. With one hand, he grabbed for Gary's hair. With the other, he poked his fingers into Gary's eyes. Ow! Gary screamed. Reflexively, he lifted his hands toward his face. The taser clattered toward the ground. Gary trapped it again with one foot. Jonah let go of Gary's hair and grabbed for the elucidator just as Gary was shoving him away, flinging him toward the stone wall. Jonah slammed against the wall hard. He thought he could feel every bone of his spine hitting rock, one bone after the other, so it took him moments to realize. The elucidator was in his hand. Ha! Jonah shouted at Gary. Gary only smiled. It doesn't matter, kid, he said. It's already programmed. That's one of the newer models. You don't even have to point it. We just do that out of habit. Jonah looked down at the screen of the elucidator, which seemed to be engaged in some kind of countdown. 10, 9, 8. As the 7 blinked onto the screen, Jonah threw the elucidator as hard as he could toward the far corner of the cave. JB, he screamed. Make it stop! Jonah could see JB catching the elucidator, hitting buttons. Somehow Jonah managed to get up, to rush across the cave toward JB. Other kids had the same idea, flocking together toward JB. Jonah started to trip over something. The taser? Wait a minute. Where had Gary gone? Goodbye, friends, JB said softly. I hope you enjoyed time prison. And then Mr. Hodge vanished too, from right in the middle of the room. Stunned, Jonah leaned over and scooped up the taser. He kept running toward JB. Is it safe now? Jonah asked. Did you stop the countdown? JB still had his head bent over the elucidator. He was still punching buttons. Jonah crowded close with Chip and Catherine and Alex pressed in tightly beside him. JB raised his head. I'm truly sorry, he said. This is what I have to do. He pointed the elucidator at Alex, and Alex disappeared. He turned the elucidator toward Chip. No! Chip screamed. Catherine clutched Chip's right arm and joined her screams to his. Jonah still had the taser in his right hand, but there wasn't time to use that. He looped his right elbow around Chip's arm, hoping to hold him in place. With his left hand, Jonah made a swipe for the elucidator. The cave was already melting away. No! Jonah wasn't even sure who was screaming. Catherine? Chip? Himself? The elucidator? Hold on. The elucidator? He could feel it in his left hand. He was clutching it as tightly as he was clutching the taser, as tightly as he had his arm wrapped around Chip's, but he couldn't see anything because he had his eyes squeezed shut. He dared to open one eye, just to crack. He and Chip and Catherine seemed to be tumbling through to the outer nothingness, but tumbling toward a vague hint of light, far off in the distance. No! This time he was sure the wail was coming from the elucidator, speaking in JB's voice. Jonah, there's been a mistake, JB's voice came out, loud and clear and anxious, straight from the elucidator. You and Catherine have no business going into the 15th century with Chip and Alex. You're not allowed. You could cause even more damage. And you can't take the elucidator or the taser there. You should have thought of that before you zapped Chip, Jonah said, and he was amazed that he could sound so defiant out here in the middle of nothingness. You should have known that we'd stick together. There was a silence, as if JB was trying to accept that. Maybe he hadn't known they would stick together. Look, I'll tell you what to do so you and Catherine can come back, JB said, his voice strained. No, Jonah said stubbornly. Tell us what to do so we can all come back, even Alex. Chip looked over at Jonah, gratitude gleaming in his eyes. Jonah, JB protested, you don't know what you're talking about. Certain things have been set in motion. Chip and Alex have to go to the 15th century. Then Catherine and I are going too, Jonah said. He didn't know how it was possible, but he could feel time flowing past him, scrolling backward. He felt like he had only a few more seconds left to convince JB. What if we could fix the 15th century? Make everything right again? Then couldn't Alex and Chip come back to the 21st century with us? Silence. Jonah had nervous tremors in his stomach. The hand holding the elucidator was shaking. He wasn't even sure what he was asking for, but he couldn't stop now. You have to let us try, Jonah argued. Let us try to save Chip and Alex and time. Or else... He had to come up with a good threat. Or else what? Oh. Or else we'll do our best to mess up time even worse than Hodge and Gary did. The silence from the elucidator continued. Jonah worried that they'd floated out of range, or that the battery had stopped working, just like a defective cell phone. Then JB's voice came through again, faint but distinct. All right, he said wearily. I'll let you try. The lights on the horizon were getting brighter. Jonah knew nothing about the 15th century. He truly didn't know what he'd bargained for. Wow, Chip said. When you make a promise, you really keep it. Promise? Jonah wondered. What promise? Then he remembered what he'd told Chip, right after Chip found out that he was adopted. I swear, I'll do anything and everything I can to help you. It seemed like he had said that hundreds of years ago, hundreds of lifetimes ago. No, hundreds of years and lifetimes ahead. Jonah's stomach gurgled. He could tell he was out of the non-time limbo because he was hungry again, starving, in fact. Do you think they have good turkey legs in the 15th century? He asked. There was no time for Chip and Catherine to answer him or to even make fun of his question. The lights were getting brighter and brighter, rushing at them faster and faster and faster. They landed. Welcome to the 15th century, JB said grimly through the elucidator. Good luck. That's the end of the book.